The Office of Budget Responsibility is going to slash its growth forecast, we hear. Some say by as much as a half. You have no fiscal headroom left. Just how serious is the country's financial situation?
I'm not going to preempt the Office of Budget Responsibility's forecast, but the world has changed. We can all see that before our eyes. And government are not inactive in that. We'll respond to the change and continue to meet our fiscal rules, but we're also shaping the new world, whether that's in the defence and security realm.
In a recent appearance on Trevor Phillips' show, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor of the Labour Party, faced tough questioning over her economic policies and Labour's approach to the ongoing financial struggles in the UK. The conversation quickly shifted to the topic of tax increases, a controversial decision made by the government amid the worsening cost of living crisis. When asked if she believed tax hikes negatively impacted the economy, Reeves gave a confident, albeit defensive response. She argued that, considering global challenges like Russia's aggression and the strain on the healthcare system, Labour's fiscal decisions were necessary to ensure the nation's stability. According to Reeves, increasing taxes and redirecting funds from overseas aid to defense was a responsible choice to strengthen national security and public services while maintaining economic health. She portrayed these decisions as a pragmatic move to ensure that public finances remained strong, avoiding cuts to essential public services. However, her defense was met with skepticism, particularly when she casually noted that the redirected funds weren't additional money, but were essentially taken from international aid. This comment raised eyebrows, with critics arguing that the reallocation of funds didn't contribute to economic growth, but merely shifted resources from one area to another. Many felt her explanation failed to acknowledge the real impact these changes would have on the UK's most vulnerable populations. As Reeves continued defending the policy, she suggested that without these difficult decisions, the UK wouldn't have been able to tackle emerging global threats or improve public services. While her perspective may have seemed reasonable from a government standpoint, those struggling to pay bills and deal with rising living costs were unlikely to share her view. For many ordinary people, Reeves' reassurance that these measures were necessary fell flat. The UK's economy may have shown growth in reports, but for the millions experiencing the pinch of inflation and stagnant wages, her words appeared detached from their reality. While her defense was rooted in government priorities, it showcased a disconnect between Labour's leadership and the daily struggles faced by the public. The interview revealed that the party, despite its intentions, had yet to offer real solutions to the economic issues plaguing ordinary citizens, leaving many to question whether Labour truly understood the scale of the challenges at hand. In her recent appearance on Trevor Phillips' show, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor of the Labour Party, found herself defending the government's approach to the UK's financial challenges, particularly regarding the contentious issue of tax hikes. As the conversation shifted to the growing financial pressures on households, Reeves was pressed on the impact of rising costs on living standards. A key point in the discussion was a report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which warned that living standards in the UK would sharply decline in the next 5 years. The foundation's research highlighted how inflation, stagnant wages, and rising poverty would affect the poorest households the most. Despite this grim outlook, Reeves dismissed the findings, asserting with confidence that living standards would improve under the current government. She claimed that the UK economy was on the mend, with wages rising faster than inflation and inflation itself slowing down. This optimistic stance, however, was met with immediate criticism. Many critics, particularly those struggling with the rising costs of essential goods like food, energy, and housing, found her comments to be out of touch with the reality they were facing. For them, the modest increases in wages mentioned by Reeves were insufficient to keep up with the steep rise in living costs. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report, which painted a much bleaker picture, resonated more closely with the experiences of families who were feeling the full impact of inflation. As Reeves continued to defend the government's economic policies, her optimism seemed increasingly disconnected from the hardships faced by millions across the country. Her insistence that the economy was improving and her portrayal of fiscal decisions as necessary and prudent were met with growing frustration from the public. Many began to question whether her upbeat rhetoric was merely a political tactic, ignoring the harsh economic reality faced by those struggling to make ends meet. While her claims about rising wages and slowing inflation could be seen as accurate on a superficial level, they didn't reflect the full scope of the financial burden that families were bearing. Energy bills, rent, and basic living expenses continued to climb, and for many, these increases far outstripped the modest wage gains Reeves pointed to. This widening gap between the government's claims and the lived experience of the people led to growing doubts about Reeves' understanding of the situation. It also raised concerns about the Labour Party's ability to address the pressing economic challenges that were facing the country. As the situation unfolded, it became clear that the government's failure to acknowledge the realities of daily life for millions of Britons was only deepening public disillusionment. Rachel Reeves' appearance on Trevor Phillips' show continued to stir controversy as her dismissive response to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's concerning report on declining living standards sparked widespread backlash. Despite her confident assertions that the economy was improving and wages were rising faster than inflation, the reality for countless British families painted a starkly different picture. While she touted economic recovery, millions of households were still struggling financially as the relentless rise in living costs outpaced any wage increases. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report had forecast a sharp decline in living standards, particularly among the UK's poorest citizens, as inflation continued to erode real wages, making it increasingly difficult to afford necessities. Despite this, Reeves remained resolute in her belief that the government's policies were paving the way for a brighter future, emphasizing wage increases and a slowdown in inflation. However, her optimism seemed disconnected from the harsh realities faced by those in the working class, and her claims appeared increasingly out of touch with the immediate struggles of ordinary families. The public, already burdened by soaring energy costs, rising housing expenses and food price hikes, found little solace in Reeves' optimistic projections. Her focus on broader economic trends failed to address the immediate financial strain that people were experiencing. For many, the combination of stagnant wages and sky-high inflation made it nearly impossible to keep up with the cost of living. Even modest wage increases couldn't offset the rising costs of everyday necessities. This created a palpable sense of insecurity and frustration, causing Reeves' assertions to come across as an attempt to distract from the urgent issues at hand. Reeves' reliance on broad economic indicators, while not entirely without merit, seemed to miss the mark for those directly impacted by the cost of living crisis. The divide between her upbeat rhetoric and the lived experiences of millions of families only deepened the growing sense of frustration among the public. Instead of offering practical solutions to address the underlying causes of the crisis, she continued to defend the government's policies, framing them as necessary for long-term economic stability. Yet, for those grappling with the immediate fallout of rising costs, such reassurances felt hollow and disconnected from their struggles. The more Reeves insisted that things were improving, the more she appeared to disregard the genuine financial difficulties faced by the most vulnerable. This growing gap between the government's narrative and the everyday reality of ordinary citizens raised important concerns about Labour's ability to effectively address the nation's economic challenges. As public trust in the government waned, the Labour Party's failure to connect with the electorate on such critical issues became an increasingly significant obstacle to its future. Rachel Reeves' refusal to acknowledge the harsh economic realities facing millions of Britons during her recent interview only intensified the growing disillusionment with the Labour Party. As the Shadow Chancellor dismissed the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's warnings about declining living standards, her stance seemed increasingly disconnected from the daily struggles of countless families. The Foundation's report painted a bleak future, predicting that the country's poorest households would be the hardest hit, with living standards declining further as inflation continued to surpass wage growth. Despite this, Reeves maintained an optimistic narrative, claiming that wages were rising faster than inflation and that living standards would improve. However, this optimistic view increasingly appeared out of touch with reality. For many families, the wage increases touted by Reeves were not nearly enough to cope with the rapidly escalating cost of living. Even as inflation slowed slightly, it remained high enough to outpace modest wage growth, meaning that for countless households, the rising costs of essentials like food, housing, and energy were still out of reach. Reeves' insistence that the economy was improving felt increasingly hollow, as families continued to struggle. Her focus on long-term recovery plans was not addressing the immediate concerns of those grappling with daily financial pressures. The growing divide between the Labour leadership's rosy projections and the lived reality of millions of working-class Britons was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As the government continued to downplay the severity of the situation, public frustration grew. Many began questioning whether Labour was truly in touch with the challenges facing ordinary people, or whether it had lost sight of the issues that matter most to voters. By refusing to acknowledge the true impact of the cost of living crisis, Reeves and her party risked further alienating the electorate. The public, tired of abstract promises and delayed improvements, was looking for immediate solutions to the problems they faced every day. As Labour's leadership continued to push a narrative of recovery, the disconnect between their words and the realities of the situation only deepened. For voters, it became increasingly clear that Labour's promises of a better future seemed to lack the urgency needed to address the immediate economic struggles facing households. This failure to connect with the electorate on such an essential issue could ultimately cost the party dearly, especially as the next election approached. With rising frustration and a growing sense of alienation, many wondered whether Labour could truly be trusted to tackle the economic challenges ahead. Rachel Reeves' recent appearance on Trevor Phillips' show exposed the growing divide between the leadership of the Labour Party and the everyday struggles of millions of British families. As Shadow Chancellor, Reeves found herself defending the government's economic decisions amidst mounting concerns about the escalating cost of living. Faced with expert reports such as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's forecast of a sharp decline in living standards, she dismissed these warnings with a level of optimism that many found increasingly out of touch. The Foundation's report highlighted that the poorest households would be hardest hit by inflation, which was eroding their purchasing power, while wages stagnated. Despite these alarming projections, Reeves confidently asserted that the economy was on the mend, claiming that wages were rising faster than inflation and that living standards would improve in the coming years. However, for many, her statements seemed disconnected from the harsh realities they were experiencing. While inflation did slow somewhat, it remained high, and wage increases, though evident, were still not sufficient to keep up with the skyrocketing costs of essentials such as food, housing, and energy. For the working-class families struggling to make ends meet, Reeves' upbeat rhetoric came across as empty and irrelevant. Her failure to recognize the economic strain faced by millions of Britons only deepened the perception that Labour's leadership was out of touch. The more Reeves insisted that the economy was improving, the more the public's frustration grew. Households living paycheck to paycheck, for instance, saw little to no relief, and the idea of improved living standards felt like an unrealistic fantasy. By focusing on wage growth without addressing the fact that these increases didn't cover the rising costs of living, Reeves seemed to ignore the genuine struggles of working families. Critics were quick to call attention to the disconnect between her optimistic predictions and the daily struggles faced by most households. How could the government claim to be making progress when real incomes were shrinking and wages weren't even close to matching inflation? Labour's failure to present concrete solutions to the ongoing economic challenges highlighted the inadequacies of its economic strategy, leaving many to question whether the party still understood the issues at the core of its original mission. Once considered the champion of the working class, Labour now appeared more concerned with maintaining a narrative of recovery than with offering tangible solutions to the public's most pressing issues. As the cost of living continued to rise, the gap between the party's rhetoric and the electorate's needs seemed increasingly unbridgeable. The pressure on Reeves and her colleagues to deliver meaningful change only intensified, leaving many to wonder whether Labour could still be trusted to navigate the country through its current economic crisis. As the Labour Party faces increasing internal and public turmoil, Rachel Reeves' leadership is coming under intense scrutiny. Despite her continuous assurances that the economy is improving under Labour's direction, these statements are beginning to fall flat, particularly among the working-class families she claims to represent. The political fallout from her recent interview with Trevor Phillips has only magnified the vulnerabilities within the party. Critics are pointing out that her refusal to acknowledge the severity of the ongoing cost of living crisis not only signals a failure in policy, but also exposes a deeper disconnect between Labour's leadership and the electorate it seeks to serve. During the interview, Reeves pushed optimistic projections regarding wage growth and inflation, but her failure to address the immediate financial struggles faced by millions of families only deepened public frustration. She insisted that living standards were improving and that wages were rising faster than inflation, yet these claims felt disconnected from the realities of day-to-day life for many Britons. For those struggling with rising energy bills, stagnant wages, and ever-increasing costs for essentials, Reeves' optimistic statements appeared tone-deaf. The public quickly became skeptical of her assertions, leaving the Labour Party's credibility at an all-time low. The growing divide between Labour's leadership and the electorate was made even clearer by the party's inability to offer substantial solutions to the cost of living crisis. Many felt that Labour, once seen as the champion of working-class issues, had failed to keep its promises and was now increasingly out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people. For example, the government's broken promise to freeze council taxes only added to the mounting financial pressures on families, who felt betrayed by yet another increase in their living costs. The failure to follow through on this pledge further undermined the party's standing with those who needed tangible relief the most. Reeves' failure to recognize the gravity of the crisis and the disconnect between her rhetoric and the lived experiences of the public has left many questioning Labour's ability to govern effectively. The party's message of economic recovery feels hollow when confronted with the reality that wages continue to stagnate while inflation keeps pushing essential costs beyond the reach of millions. Instead of offering practical solutions or even acknowledging the struggle faced by those most affected, Labour's leadership continues to push for an economic narrative that seems detached from the challenges confronting the electorate. As Labour's credibility falters, the public's disillusionment grows. Many feel that the party, instead of offering a path forward, has simply grown increasingly disconnected from the real needs of the people. With the cost of living crisis worsening and no clear solutions in sight, Labour's ability to connect with voters on this key issue is rapidly deteriorating. As the next election looms closer, the party's future remains uncertain, with its failure to address the economic struggles faced by millions threatening to undermine its chances of regaining public trust. See you again.